Good morning. Let's see. This is the last one for this, right?
Yes.
And then do you have a break, or are you starting something new? Job next week. So do I have a where? I don't see her. Is Donna here? No. Oh, I was gonna say I don't think I have a schedule beyond today, so I imagine she's probably gonna give me one at some, or maybe she has and I just don't have it. Could be the case. All right, so we're finishing up kind of this whole minor prophet, kind of sort of part of the minor prophets, and really the end. And as I was going through this, I kept thinking to myself, didn't you already do this one? Because everything seems so familiar. But then I remembered I filled in for Pastor Campbell on a Sunday morning when he was finishing up his minor prophet series, and it just happened to be that I had the book of Malachi. And so I was like, now I know why this all sounds so familiar. I'm like, didn't I already do this one? But it wasn't with you. It was with somebody else. So I'll give you a couple points that jump out at me, especially this last part of Malachi. But then if there's any other questions that you guys have as well. Malachi means my messenger, and so this theme of messenger pops up again and again and again, and really there's three different messengers that are being talked about. There's the messenger Malachi, who's delivering this message in this day that he is speaking, and then he speaks of two other messengers. Do you know who those two messengers were? John the Baptist and Jesus. Right, Christ, the ultimate messenger, the real. So Malachi the messenger talks about John the Baptist the messenger, who ultimately talks about Jesus the messenger. Another thing that strikes me, and this happens in other places in Scripture too, but it's specific here. When he talks about, he makes reference to the refiner's All right. Ooh, there I am. Plug myself in somehow. Okay, there we go. So when he talks about this refiner's fire, sometimes we hear that as thinking like refiner's fire as in kind of a negative sense, like it's burning away all the stuff that isn't needed, and it feels harsh, and it feels painful. But I think when you think about that refiner's fire, I want you to think about it in a positive light, in the sense that the Lord is burning away, taking away all of the bad, and producing in us something good by way of Jesus, by way of his Spirit. And so he is forming you into something new and useful. And it's not an issue, and I think the picture kind of breaks down a little bit, because I don't want us to think that, we got some good in us somewhere, and God had just like wipes away the bad and reveals the good. You know, that kind of goes along the thinking of, well, we're all good people deep down. No, we're not. We're all dirty, rotten sinners deep down. And so this refining, the refiner's fire, it's an analogy that I think kind of falls apart a little bit. But he does create us to be something new, something useful, and he does that in and through Jesus. And the first part of Malachi especially, but a little bit of this section too, as you've been reading, Malachi was really laying into the people of Israel, wasn't he? They kind of had messed up in a lot of different ways. They were messing up in terms of their marriage vows, right? Men were just willy-nilly divorcing their wives for other women, and Malachi says, no, that's not the way this works. They were messing up in terms of their offerings in the temple as well. They were to bring their first fruits. They were supposed to bring their best, and yet they were bringing these sickly animals for their offerings. And the priests, he got on the priests as well, because the priests were doing what? They were allowing it, right? They were letting it go. It's like, if you watch a basketball team at practice and all the kids are screwing around, not doing what they're supposed to. Well, yeah, that's on them. They're not doing what they're supposed to. But I would say it's also on who? The coach, because he's not getting on their case or she's not getting on their case to get them doing what they're supposed to do. And I think that's how Malachi was addressing both the people, but then also the priests, because they were allowing this behavior to happen. The other section here in Malachi that I actually love, and I've talked about it before, is when God says, "Return to me, and I will return to you." And sometimes that can be misunderstood as thinking like God has now given you something to do. Like you have to make the first move. You have to come to me, and then everything will be good. And that's really a backwards way of thinking about it, because he says, "Return to me." In other words, God hasn't gone anywhere. If he's telling us to return to him, what's the implication? We have done what? We have run away. We have run away. And God says, I have not changed. I am still the gracious God that I always was. I am the one that called you by name. And I would even suggest he is coming after you. And so he's basically saying, stop running in the other direction. Let me take hold of you. And it fits really well with this weekend's gospel reading coming up, where Jesus looks at Jerusalem, and it says he weeps over Jerusalem. And he said, so many times I wanted to, and he uses the analogy of a hen gathering her chicks. And he said, but you wouldn't have it. You wouldn't have it. And this idea of just constantly, we as sinners resist and run away, and yet Jesus desperately wants to draw us in under his wings. Let me just look if there's anything else I wanted to. No, I think those are the big things. Anything else that jumped out at you guys that you had questions about? Yeah. We asked about tithing. Uh-huh.
The question was, is tithing your offering only to your church, or does it encompass any other benevolent giving?
Well, and again, we're just talking, this is more of, I don't necessarily think this is rules as much as it is understanding the terms that they used in the scriptures. So that when they talk about tithing, that was strictly the percentage, 10% of what was required of the people of Israel to bring to the temple, to serve to serve the purposes of the temple, everything from upkeep to making sure the priests had food, to sacrifices that needed to be done. Almsgiving and giving to the poor, that was something different than a tithe. And so if there were beggars on the street, if you were giving money to them or something to them, that wasn't considered tithing. That was considered almsgiving. Sometimes sometimes in church you'll even hear us say this. We'll say, God has good use of our tithes and our offerings, right? And so partly that's just, a tithe is strictly 10%. And that's not like a rule thing. It's just the definition of what it is. And so technically I'm like, well, if I'm only giving 4% or someone's giving 26%, they're not technically giving a tithe. It's just a legalistic way of looking at the word. And so we throw the word offerings in there to indicate whatever you're bringing, whether you're bringing strictly a tithe, 10%, or if you're bringing less or if you're bringing more, those are all acceptable to God. God rejoices in all of them. Some people, and this is just personal choices on the giver, because when we come to the New Testament, we don't talk about a tithe as a requirement anymore. Instead, the New Testament, Jesus and the disciples talk this way. They talk about first fruit percentage giving. In other words, we give first, giving in faith, and we give percentage giving means we are to give in the proportion that has been given to us. And so we don't talk about tithing as a rule anymore in the church. And the phrase I love the most is first fruits percentage giving. And you say, well, what does that look like in terms of real life, figuring out what you're giving the church? And very practical, I would say that in our family, we do this around tax time, so we're doing it almost now since I'm always behind in my taxes, is that you look at what you're bringing in, and then you pick your percentage, and there, again, there's no rule. You pick your percentage before you do anything else as to what you're giving to the church for the use, for the good of God's kingdom, and you, it's almost like you set that aside first, and then you figure out the rest of your budget for the year. That's all it means, and there is great freedom in that, I will tell you, because once you've decided, okay, this is my percentage, that's the number, let's get on with life. We use electronic giving, so I just don't even have to think about it. It's a done deal. And some people, well, you're not thinking about it. That doesn't sound very pious. That doesn't sound very, very giving and Christian. It works for me, right? We did it. We said, this is what we're going to do. This is the percentage we're going to use. We're good to go. That's the way I think God designed giving to be. He didn't design giving to be this great burden and guilt-stricken, shameful act that I have to I need to write my check this morning. I mean, if that floats your boat, by all means do it. But I think he gives us gifts to glorify him and to support the proclamation of the gospel and to serve our neighbor, which includes first and foremost your family, the people living under your house that he has called you by way of your vocation to care for. Now, to get back to your original question, I think it's a family Christian decision to decide, okay, these great gifts that God has given us, how am I going to decide what portion of that goes to support the proclamation in my local congregation as opposed to what portion of that goes to support the greater good in the world, or what proportion of that goes to, I don't know, my local Red Cross, or what proportion of that goes to caring for my neighbor who's a single mom who always seems to be running into financial problems. I mean, those are gifts for each individual Christian based on, I think, the vocation that God has given them in life. And they make those decisions along the way. What I would say is this, is that if there is someone who says, I don't give to my church because I've decided that I'm going to give my entire tithe to the homeless people in Chicago, and every Saturday I go down and I give my 10%, whatever that is, out on the streets. God love you. But I think that there is, when we think about, even in the New Testament, that part of giving and supporting the proclamation of the gospel is giving to your local congregation in order to make that proclamation happen. Because as wonderful and as gracious it is to go down to the streets of Chicago and buy food for people, is that the proclamation of the gospel, that Jesus lived, died, and rose for you? It is not. An atheist can go down to the streets of Chicago and give food to the poor who don't have it. Now, I'm not suggesting that Christians shouldn't do that. I'm just suggesting that people see very clearly the difference between the proclamation of a crucified and risen Jesus and loving your neighbor. Christ expects us to do both, but we shouldn't sacrifice the greater in order to do the thing that sometimes makes us feel better. Does that make sense? I know you have a question, Sarah, I can tell.
Okay, well, this is not like a super deep. This is like a super practical, like trying to think this through. So let's say that, because I mean, we do the same thing you do, probably with less thought, but we do the same thing you do where it's like, okay, we're going to give this percentage to
Yeah, so I can just tell you how we personally do it in our house, and I'm not saying this is even the right way. I don't know. It might not be. But when we figure out what we're giving to our local congregation, and if I get a call somewhere else someday, my giving at this congregation ends. And now my giving begins at whatever new local congregation I'm at to support the proclamation of the gospel in that place. That is a set thing for us. That never changes. And so whether it be I want to support Ukraine, or whether it be, oh my gosh, I have a child who's in college now. And have you ever seen a college bill? Like, it's a very disturbing thing to hold in your hand when you look at the size of that. I'm sure some of you have. It's a very disturbing thing to hold in your hand. Or when I look and I say, maybe a family member, maybe my sister or something, lost her job and they're hard up and they need help with their rent, and we want to help them with, or help with their mortgage or something. We want to help them that. We don't touch the giving that we're giving to the local church. We take that from something else. We just don't mess with that. Now, we could talk for hours on how the church could do a better job helping people understand what faithful giving, tithing, and offerings to the congregation does. And actually, Claudia just sent me an article on it yesterday about that, and it was something like the 8 reasons why members don't give, and it was just a fascinating. It was kind of an interesting read, and there were simple things, simply like one of them was because the congregation doesn't ask. Another one was, and I'm like, oh yeah, I guess you're right. But a lot of them had to do with being better communicators, the congregation, the leadership, being better communicators as to how those gifts are being used, which I think is a valid thing. So some of your tithes go to supporting work in Belize. Some of your giving goes to supporting the Northern Illinois district. Some of your giving goes to pay my health insurance, or portion of my health insurance. Some of your giving goes to pay that we can have the lights on in this building. Part of it goes to support Helping Hands. Part of it and the list could go on and on and on and on as the things that that your giving supports. And so I think that's something that we as not just this congregation, but every congregation could do a better job at doing, is explaining how these go to use. Because I just take it for granted that everyone just assumes that, yeah, we're putting them to really good use. But we shouldn't just assume that. We should communicate that.
Well, the bottom line is when we give our gifts, whether it be, the quote-unquote tithe to the church, or, a memorial for somebody, or, special, I got something from Lutheran High School the other day.
Mm-hmm.
That all should come from the heart, and that's why I'd like to think that's why I do it. I mean, if I don't have any affection or any interest in something, I'm not going to contribute to anything.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's a passion for mine, I'm going to be, bequeathing my income or my gifts, to them. And that's why I don't sign up for electronic giving, because like you just said, well, it's taken care of. I don't have to worry about it. But I don't worry about my giving, because when the first of the month, whatever, I do my budget, and then that's the first thing I write. And so I feel like, I don't want to sound pious, but it does really, truly come from my heart.
Yeah, no, and I didn't mean to make it sound like everybody should do it my way, because I think it is a personal preference. It's a spiritual discipline that for some people it's very meaningful to do that. It's a reminder. One of the reasons I give electronically is because, so when we go on vacation in the summertime and I miss a weekend and I come back, and in the years prior when we used to write the checks, I want to be a joyful giver. But I'm telling you, when I pull out that check and go, man, I got to write twice as big this week. Or 3 times as big. And every now and then, it was tempting to be like, maybe like 1.5 times as big, if I missed 2 weeks. Then there was that temptation For me now, okay, we get it done, it's over with. I don't put myself in the place of temptation anymore. So it'd be like, so if I smoked cigarettes and I decided I'm going to quit smoking, and I always bought my cigarettes at the same convenience store that I drove by on the way home. It makes no sense for me to say, boy, I really need a pack of gum today. I'm going to go stop at that convenience store. No, dummy, don't do that. Find a new convenience store. Because then it won't, don't put yourself, it's like when I used to work with high schoolers and junior high kids more often, and they'd say, well, I can go to that party where there's drinking because I'm not going to drink. Stupid. Don't put yourself in that situation. So that's why we give electronically, because it avoids these tempting situations to say, well, I wasn't here this week, so I'm not going to worry about it. Just takes it all taken care of. So it's good for me. The other reason for me is that sometimes, if I'm just being completely honest, giving is not joyful for me. No. I have lots of bills. Lots of them. Child in college. And I am blessed to work in this place, but my wife and I are Lutheran educators. You know what our retirement fund is? Streets paved with gold. I'm trusting that Christ returns before I retire. Okay? And so I don't like it. I don't like having to say, oh, and so the electronic thing allows me to say, to take my feelings out of it. Take my feelings out of it. Now, when I look at, it's tax time, and so I get my statement from the church office, and I go, I look at that, and can I find joy that God is having good use of what we have given to the church? Yes. But if I'm completely honest, the sinful nature looks at me and that number that Claudia gives me, and I go, where's that college bill again? Because you're like, what the heck? I'm just being honest, And so there is a spiritual discipline, I think, in saying, I'm going to do this because I know it's good for me, and I know it's good for the kingdom. It's kind of like this. Do I like eating veggies? Maybe some of you love veggies. I hate vegetables. Can't stand eating them. If I had my choice, I would eat pizza, French fries, and drink beer every day. That was what I would do. But I can't do that. It's not good for me. And so there are times, or going for a run. I hate running. People are like, oh, Pastor Richard, I thought you were a big runner. I run. I don't like it. I hate it with all my being. So why do you do it? Because I know it's good for me. It keeps me healthy. And so tithing for me, giving to the church for me, kind of falls into that category. I don't particularly enjoy it, but I know it's good for me, and so I have to set up these disciplines in my life because I know it's good for me, and I know it's good for the kingdom. And there you go, God. We're good to go. Is that law-oriented giving? Maybe it is. I confess.
Okay, so I have one more.
Yep.
So when you say, because I have struggled with, I also am not I realize I do my finances with a lot of fear back there. I'm like, oh, but we could, but what if something happens? What if we could, So I also struggle with joyful giving. But I struggle also with being like, all right, God, we got it. Because, I give my 10%, but then it's like, but did you need to go to the movie? Because there's people over there that
Right.
can't even afford food.
So here's another sin of mine. This is like confession time for Pastor Richard. So, but again, I think, hey, we're family, I can tell you. And so one of my struggles is I use my percentage giving to the church, which is generous, as a reason sometimes not to give to other things. I don't need to donate to the Red Cross. I give to the church. That's where all of my giving happens. Now, is that good or bad? I don't know. There's probably a sinful nature aspect of that. But there is definitely a part where I say, no, I have a place where I give. And this is where I give. And I trust the Lord is going to have good use of that. Is that an excuse not to give in other places? I don't know. I mean, does that mean I'm never generous with anything? No, of course not. If my sister, I have had family members that are in need of money. We write them a check. We have had things here. When we have if we're purchasing flowers for somebody on staff who's in the hospital, I don't say, sorry, you gave it the office, right? No, I'm going to write a check for that too. But sometimes I fall into the trap, I think, of thinking that I use the excuse, I'm not going to be any more generous there because I've already done my generosity here. It's probably not the best attitude, especially if God has given me the opportunity to give. It's funny, and I'm sure this is why I came up in Malachi, the whole he says to test me on this, right? And it's fascinating, and I don't even know how to say it. I'm almost afraid to say it because I'm not even sure what I think about it. In our married life, my wife and I have practiced first fruits percentage giving. Finances at times have been extremely tight. We have never been in want, ever. And I would even say, at a miraculous level, God has taken care of us financially. Like, I could tell you some crazy stories and gone, Now, do I think that God blesses us financially because I tithe, because I give a percentage gift? Well, I don't think it's like this little trick. I don't think it's this little game that God's playing. I don't think he's saying, well, okay, Richard, you're doing that, so we're going to do, I'm going to do. No, I don't think that's how it is. But I can, without a doubt, say God has taken care of us financially. Sometimes in some pretty unbelievably miraculous ways that I would have never dreamed of. Sometimes it's through family members. Sometimes it's through congregation members. Sometimes it's just simply a bill that we thought was going to be $6,000. The hospital forgives. And you're like, where'd that come from? And things like that have happened for us again and again and again, almost to the level that we feel guilty about it at times. Because I see so many people, and maybe it's just, and I'm sure you do too, but I see a lot of people in my role that are struggling financially tremendously. And from my perspective, it seems like in an unfair way. Why should they struggle so much? How come they don't get these little just things that drop out of the sky for us that we get to take care of us in every way? I wish that would happen for them. So I don't think that those things happen for us because we give. I don't think God plays those kinds of games. But I do think that God keeps his promises to take care of us. It might not always be financial. It'll be for eternity. But up until now, the Lord has taken care of us. And my only response to that is, thanks be to God. And it does put a little fear in my heart to stop. I was talking, actually, I had this conversation with a friend a long time ago. And he's like, because I was talking to him about how, giving is like really hard for me. He's like, well, why don't you just stop? And I said, well, and I gave him the same thing, because I know it's good for me and I know it's good for the kingdom. But I also said, I'm kind of afraid to stop. I'm kind of afraid to stop because it's been going pretty good all the way through. And I don't know what I think about that theologically, but I'm just going to keep white. I'm not going to upset the boat. I'm just going to keep on going and say, okay, Lord, you've taken care of us to this way. This will be my last thing. I'll let you go. I don't know anybody who has ever gone into poverty because of their giving to the church. You know what I mean by that? Like, you might say, well, what about someone like Mother Teresa? I think if you were to ask Mother Teresa if she considers herself in poverty, if you would have asked her, she would have said what? No, she's not in poverty. She's rich in the greatest way in the entire planet. Or any of these missionaries who have no money and none of the material possessions that we do in the United States of America. If you were to ask them, aren't you suffering because of your... They'd look at you cross-eyed and go, what are you talking about? We're not suffering in any way, shape, or form. So I guess it is a joy. Maybe I give joyfully more than I think I do.
One of the questions was the expectation. Because we're giving, do we expect something in return?
And that's where it gets dicey, is that I don't think we should. We give faithfully because God is faithfully given to us. I don't give going, oh, I'm going to give because that way God will take care of me. It's the other way around. God is always taking care of us, therefore we're going to give. You see the difference? It's kind of flipping the script the other way. And I think sometimes God puts, I think God, for marriages sometimes, especially and in families, I think God sometimes puts a husband and wife together to balance each other out in that. And many of the couples that I've talked to, almost always, there was one who was like, what are you, crazy giving the church? There's so much things that need to be paid for in life. And the other one's like, well, no, that's what we do. And they kind of balance out and work it through. And I don't know if that's the rule all the time, but I probably count on both hands the number of times I've met with couples and finances came up and one was this way and one was that way, and they kind of helped each other out and figuring it through. So, anything else? All right, cool. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks.